Hey guys, it's Saran Q again. I guess it's my turn to talk about Skinner chapter 11, and this chapter is focusing on the self and others. So, kind of a chapter overview where we break down each section and what I kind of got, and definitely feel free to comment or correct me in the comments below, or not below, but on the blackboard. So, the overview for this chapter is people tend to say they know themselves better than others. What they're actually saying is they know their own internal feelings and introspects, being that it's actually self-knowledge is just being in contact with oneself. The idea of self-knowledge was based on the introspection of that's seen from a historic view of our environments and contingencies. This is a way that leads to self-management. We learn to control others because we learn to control our own behavior to the change in our own situations. So that's kind of the overview I got. Going from there, looking at the first section of this chapter, which is knowing oneself. Skinner starts off the chapter with the science of behavior studies the human organism, but neglects the person or self. This is a kind of idea. What I got from this was kind of the idea of a person can describe an idea of spirits or different type of personalities where if they do something good, it's a genius or a great spirit kind of possessing that person. But if they do something bad, it's they do something evil. It's a devil possessing. It's a very crude way of saying that is what Skinner's talking about. It's not necessarily talking about the person themselves, what they're feeling, which is you're gonna see a lot of mentalistic kind of thoughts throughout this, I guess. And I'm gonna try my best not to use mentalism, which is kind of confusing, knowing that Skinner's definitely against it. So it was kind of confusing to me. So in behavior analysis, a person is an organism, and which because of the organism we have a repertoire of behavior, and that's dependent on our environment and the contingencies of our environment. So going from these different contingencies, we have different personalities within the skin. So Skinner moves to the idea of what happens when a repertoire is acquired or taken or has his idea. Um, and what he's saying is an example of this is I determine what if someone were to say I determine what I shall do next. You're saying that this I is no longer free in choice because just a minute ago you said what you were going to do. So he says all that to say a person is not an originating agent. We're not I guess not necessarily original in the sense we're copied. He even references us to locusts, which I thought was interesting because when there's a group of locusts, they tend to change their behavior depending on what the other locusts are doing. So, in a way of saying that it's talking about the environmental conditions in which, when it all comes together, it makes a person uniquely different. None of us are the same or apart, have the same, I guess, contingencies within our life and environmental experiences. So we aren't all alike. So we we don't behave necessarily alike. So that mentalistic way of saying that needs to be kind of changed is when someone says, "Oh, they're like so and so." You have to be very careful because you don't know the background of that person. They may have a similar background, but they haven't really experienced the same thing that that person experienced. Does that make sense? So, in the next session, knowing oneself, Skinner starts with a question: who can know about whom? He says that to answer within contingencies about the sides of us really knowing self and the known. I kind of had to break this down to where within us we all have that kind of two people within us where and he gives the example of a tennis player hitting or missing an easy setup, and he knows he missed it and the known self knows he missed it, so it's equally, I guess, as bad. So this leads us to self-knowledge being of a social type origin. Going from this social point, it is looking in different communities and studying, I guess, the genetic history and the amounts of self-knowledge in different ways. That kind of answers the old question of can you explain yourself to someone else, and how you explain yourself to someone else. and to yourself. So we're going to go through a lot of those different things. So the example that he gives for this is that if someone acts bravely, they you don't know what the environmental contingencies behind that person acting brave. It may be a social thing. If you don't act brave, you receive a punishment for showing fear. So he speaks on this by the inner search and explains that if these contingencies were to be changed, you then know how that person really felt. And he even uses a quote from Socrates, which is a Greek theorist from way back in the day. This also goes into to where he says that his quote is "Know thyself." The main point of all that is that the feelings tends to relate to a sense of self or self-image. So feelings relate to that. And he goes on to say that self-knowledge is learning how one acknowledges their own feelings. So because of all this, Skinner's saying to change becomes a part of our repertoire, and when that repertoire is just thrown into, I guess, chaos a little, we tend to act and say mostly that we weren't ourselves. We were acting as someone else. We're basically trying to pin the blame, I guess, on someone else because we're not trying to convict ourselves. We're just going through that kind of mental crisis. Going from there, Skinner says we should ask why do you feel that way. Instead of asking that, you should say basically, why do you feel that way instead of how do you feel that way or how do you feel. We say why do you feel that way because it's talking about not just the feelings and introspects of that person. It's talking about the environment of that person as well having an effect on their behavior, and we tend to not pay attention to our surroundings when we're exhibiting a behavior. So that's kind of the point of that. I know it's kind of confusing, but it goes on. The next section is knowing another person. It starts with an observer really making that first encounter to discover how someone feels or thinking. The observer has to distinguish why a person is behaving like they are and why they feel as though what's happening to them. An observer has to know the person even if they can't really explain how they know the person. And Skinner's saying this is all just predicting. We predict really from expression, and we can't trust expression at all, really. So I think that this part is where they're talking about when he's saying altering contingency, really finding out what somebody is really feeling and exhibiting will know the truth of what they're saying, because we can't really trust expressions. And the example he uses is when someone is under anesthesia, where maybe there's something wrong with the anesthesia not working, and outside you see the person has a blank face, but on the inside they're screaming in pain because they're having something removed like a liver or something. You can totally feel it, but your expression is blank. And he says it's easier basically to communicate through our feelings where we're speaking, and we speak to try, I guess, convey our feelings to someone and try to change that situation, which leads us to, I guess, knowing how to drive someone to feel a certain way with you. And even though they're not going to feel exactly what they're feeling, you still have kind of an idea. Like, say, for instance, it goes back to that part before where I was saying everyone comes from different environments and contingency backgrounds where you're not going to know. You can have an idea of what that person was feeling, but you're not going to know exactly what they're feeling. And he uses the example of concentration camps, which I thought was very interesting. Of course, he's like saying that just because that person who's in that Jewish concentration camp is feeling a certain way, and you have empathy and show that, or sympathy and show that with that person, you're not going to ever know what exactly they were feeling at that moment in time in that situation. So I thought that was kind of that section was kind of confusing, but it kind of ties down again with the section managing oneself. Self-management is the idea of willpower and basically learning, and it can't be learned through one lifetime. And that's where we have all these golden rules and proverbs saying you should do this, this, and that, and you'll be successful. And so this being said, looking at reinforcing effects, we don't see necessarily feelings, we see consequences of a certain behavior. So what he's saying here is you're more likely to listen to someone if they're rich and wealthy, and if they're telling you how to become rich and wealthy, and all you're seeing is the benefit. You're not necessarily seeing their behaviors. You're seeing what they've done to get what they've got, if that makes sense. So, and this self-management becomes dependent on the kind of the private stimuli dealing with operant conditioning. So going from managing oneself, we're kind of going to the next section where we're managing the person. So talking, Skinner uses the past events of like our past stories and mythologies of Greek mythology where these gods have put like crazy feelings in someone and they're trying to change that person. Skinner takes a different approach by saying that we should change the world they're living in, and by changing the world they're living in, then we change their feelings and their introspectives of that person. And this is a form of operant conditioning, where we're taking the advantage of the contingencies and using that as reinforcement. So Skinner's using reinforcers to make self-knowledge relevant, where we feel pressure on a situation already, and we make the pressure feeling already more pressurized. If that makes sense. So an example of this is we must make the actual, I guess, pressure of stopping at a stop sign. If you don't stop at a stop sign, you already have the pressure of if a police officer sees you, you may get a ticket, or you also will run past the stop sign and end up crashing into a different car. So there's already these types of different pressures upon us that make these constituents of behavior different and the outcomes different. It is all with that. It's often confused. That Skinner says is arranging contingencies is kind of operant reinforcement is often confused with describing them. So I'm getting this right. I'm kind of reading from my notes here, so I don't get this confusing or make this confusing. The major difference is the contingency shape and the rules governing the behaviors often confuse and kind of intertwine with each other. We describe behavior based on the identity of the relevant consequences. So we base our behavior on consequences. A good example that he uses is the law. We see that if we break the law, we know that we broke the law, and on top of knowing that we broke the law, we're also going to jail. So this right here leads, I guess this kind of topic leads into the emotional and emotional and motivational measures, to where we see good and we're in a position of good and can bring good to someone else. They're more likely to listen to us if we're under the control of a stimulus, or they're under the control of a stimulus. So that's more so of what he's talking about. And I thought something that was interesting when I was reading was his topic about how education is what's standing in the way of effective education is the attitudes and expression are expressed in the structure of the school systems affect the contingentative and creative potential of virtual every child, as to do the feelings and personalities of teachers and the supervisors. So what I got from that was, if you're in a classroom where the I guess teacher or supervisors are all kind of down and depressed, you're creating this kind of negative environment, the students are going to be kind of negative. But if you have an environment where the teacher's positive, the supervisor's positive, the school has basically a positive environment, your students are more so going to be effective. So I think like I said before, the overall section of this chapter is not exactly trusting the outer expressions of feelings. It's knowing the environments that let us know how a person's either going to feel or react, or basically taking their environment and basing it on their behavior. So I will have my question listed. I'm kind of running out of time. We're on crunch time here, so I'll have my questions listed and see what you guys think. And if I mess this whole chapter up of not understanding it all, please let me know. I may have missed the point completely, but definitely let me know. And thanks. Bye.